Three gods in the Old Testament made God do something he had never done before, not send a plague, not a flood, not fire from heaven. He left. These three gods didn't attack Israel from the outside. They infiltrated from within. One turned worship into a business transaction. One gave God a wife he never asked for. Archaeologists found the proof. And one required parents to burn their children alive while drums drowned out the screams. This is the story of Baal, Molech, and Asherah, the three gods that made God abandon his own people. And by the end, you will never look at the story of the Israelites the same way again. When Joshua led Israel across the Jordan around 1400 BC, they entered a world they had never lived in. For 40 years in the wilderness, every need was met by God directly. Manna every morning, water from rock, clothes that did not wear out. Not one of them had ever planted a seed and waited for rain. Then they crossed into Canaan, and the manna stopped. The day after they ate from the land, it ceased. For the first time in a generation, Israel faced a question that would define everything that followed. What if the rains don't come? There is one detail about Canaan's religious system that almost nobody talks about, and it explains everything. The gods of Canaan were not spiritual. They were economic. Baal offered rain. Asherah offered children and fertile wombs. The entire system was transactional. Perform the ritual, the god delivers the result. Religion functioned as an insurance policy. The premiums were paid in grain, in flesh, and in blood. Israel did not walk into superstition. They walked into an economic theology that had been running for centuries, and they did not abandon Yahweh to embrace it. The book of Judges records that Israel served Yahweh and the Baals simultaneously. They kept the feasts, they maintained the priesthood, and then, just in case, they also maintained the local altars on the hilltops. The logic sounded reasonable to people who had never farmed and were terrified of drought. It was spiritually catastrophic. What followed was a cycle that repeated 7 times. Faith, then compromise, then idolatry, then oppression, then rescue, then faith again. Each rotation pulled deeper. What began as a roadside altar on a hilltop would not stop there. It never does. It moved inward, slowly, generationally, until one day it was inside the temple itself. The first god is the one the Bible mentions by name more than any other foreign deity, over 90 times across the Hebrew scriptures. His name means simply Lord or Master, and in the world of ancient Canaan, that title belonged to the storm. Baal, specifically Baal-Hadad, was the rider of clouds, the commander of lightning, the god who split the sky open and sent the rain that made everything grow. In an agricultural economy where a single failed rainy season could mean mass starvation, Baal was not a religious curiosity. He was an economic system. Worshipping Baal was the ancient prosperity gospel. Perform the right rituals, maintain the right shrines, and the rain will come. Your crops will produce, your family will eat. For centuries, this system operated at the folk level. Small shrines, local priests, hilltop altars scattered across the countryside. Troubling, persistent, condemned repeatedly by the prophets. But then, in 874 BC, something changed. And it changed everything. King Ahab of Israel married Jezebel, daughter of the king of Sidon. This was not a political alliance that happened to include a religious complication. This was a religious revolution that used a political marriage as its vehicle. Jezebel arrived not as a queen quietly maintaining her private faith. She arrived as a missionary. She brought with her 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, all of them funded directly from the royal treasury. She commissioned the construction of a temple to Baal in Samaria, the capital city, and she began the systematic execution of Yahweh's prophets. For the first time in Israel's history, Baal worship was not a local folk practice tolerated on the margins. It was government policy. It had state funding, royal protection, and an institutional clergy. The playing field had not tilted, it had inverted. Into this moment stepped one man, a prophet from Tishbe in Gilead, a man about whom the text offers almost no background, no genealogy, no origin story, no title. Just a name, Elijah, and a declaration. There would be no rain in Israel except at his word. 3.5 years passed. The drought Elijah announced was not a minor agricultural setback, it was a civilization-level crisis. Crops were dead, livestock were dying, the streams had dried up, and every day of that drought was a public argument against Baal, the rain god who could not send rain, the prosperity god who had delivered nothing. When Elijah finally called for the confrontation on Mount Carmel, the terms were simple. 2 altars, 2 sacrifices. The God who answers with fire is the real God. 1 prophet against 450. What followed was not a magic contest. It was a public bankruptcy hearing against a false deity. Baal's prophets cried out from morning until noon. They leaped around the altar. They cut themselves with swords and lances until blood ran down their arms. They prophesied in frenzy until the evening sacrifice, and the sky was silent. Then Elijah repaired the broken altar of Yahweh with 12 stones, 1 for each tribe of a nation that had fractured itself chasing other gods. He dug a trench around it. He had water poured over the sacrifice until it ran down and filled the trench. And he prayed 1 prayer, measured, direct. 33 words in the Hebrew. The fire fell. It consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the dust, and the water in the trench. The people fell on their faces. The 450 prophets of Baal were seized, and that same evening, the rain returned. The silence of Baal had become a verdict. But here is what makes that verdict so devastating to read in retrospect. Within 1 generation, Baal worship returned to Israel. The altars were rebuilt, the shrines were restored. The archaeological record confirms Baal worship persisting in Israel for another century after Carmel. No thunder from heaven reversed it. No miracle sustained the momentum. Over and over, Israel chose the transaction over the relationship. The insurance policy over the covenant. The visible altar over the invisible God. Baal was loud. Baal was public. Baal operated in the open, on the hilltops, under the sky. The second deity was different. Her name was Asherah, and she didn't attack from the hilltop. She entered the home. Asherah was the mother goddess of the Canaanite world, the goddess of fertility, of sexuality, of the sea, and of life itself. Where Baal was thunder and spectacle, Asherah was quiet and domestic. She was represented by wooden poles or stylized trees planted beside altars, carved into household objects, shaped into small clay figurines that archaeologists have found by the thousands across Israelite homes, and not just Canaanite ones. Her imagery echoed something ancient and deeply human. The tree of life, the nurturing mother, the source of living things. Baal operated in the open, Asherah entered the home, and that distinction made her the more dangerous of the two. The book of Jeremiah captures her worship in a single scene that is striking precisely because of how ordinary it appears. Chapter 7, verse 18. The children gather the wood, the fathers kindle the fire, the women knead dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. The entire family, together. Children gathering wood as they would for any household task. fathers lighting fires as they would on any ordinary morning, mothers in the kitchen shaping the offerings with their hands. This was not a fringe practice carried out by rebels in the dark. This was domestic religion woven into the rhythms of family life. Children grew up watching it. They absorbed it as normal before they were old enough to question it. They passed it to their own children without a second thought, the way every generation passes on what it has always known. When scholars excavate Iron Age Israelite homes and find small terracotta figurines of a woman holding her breasts, figurines almost certainly associated with Asherah worship, they find them not in temples, not in sacred sites, but in kitchens, in storage rooms, in the corners of ordinary houses. This was a faith that had stopped being a choice and had become an assumption. In 1975, archaeologists excavating a site called Kuntilet Ajrud in the northern Sinai, a remote desert way station dating to approximately 800 BC, discovered inscriptions on large ceramic storage jars. Among them was a phrase that scholars have been debating ever since. Written in ancient Hebrew by Israelites was this: "I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah, Yahweh's Asherah," written not by Canaanites, not by pagans who had never known the God of Israel, written by Israelites who had simply, over time, generation by generation, household by household, grafted the mother goddess into their understanding of God himself. In their minds, Asherah was not a rival to Yahweh. She was his wife, the goddess responsible for conception, for safe delivery, for the cry of a newborn in the night. Where Yahweh governed the heavens and the covenant, Asherah governed the womb. They had not abandoned him. They had completed him. They had given the God of Israel a consort, softened his edges, domesticated his jealousy, and made him more comfortable to live with. They did not commit idolatry. They committed identity theft against the Almighty. But the most disturbing moment in the entire history of Asherah worship in Israel doesn't come from an archaeological site in the Sinai. It comes from a single verse in the second book of Kings, chapter 21, verse 7. King Manasseh, who ruled Judah for 55 years, the longest reign of any king in the Davidic line, placed a carved image of Asherah inside the Holy of Holies. To understand what that means, you have to understand what that room was. The Holy of Holies was not simply the most important room in the temple. It was the most sacred physical coordinate on earth. No furniture filled it except one object: the Ark of the Covenant, overlaid with gold, crowned by the mercy seat, flanked by two golden cherubim, whose wings stretched toward each other across the space where God's presence was understood to rest. This was not symbolic. This was the dwelling place of the living God on earth, the place where heaven touched ground. No one entered it, not the king, not the priests, not the Levites. Only one man held the right of entry, the high priest. And he entered only once a year, on the Day of Atonement, after days of ritual purification, carrying blood and incense, moving in prescribed sequence, knowing that a single deviation from the order, a single procedural error, an unconfessed sin, an impure thought, could mean he would not walk back out. The bells on the hem of his garment were not decoration. They were a signal to the priests waiting outside. As long as the bells rang, he was still alive. That room, that specific room. Manasseh placed the carved image of Asherah inside it, and it stood there for 55 years. For 55 years, every high priest who entered on the Day of Atonement approached the mercy seat, the place of God's presence, with a Canaanite fertility idol standing in the same room. For 55 years, the most sacred space in the world was shared between the God of Israel and the goddess Israel had decided was his wife. For 55 years, God shared his room with a lie. And here is what makes that silence so devastating. God did not strike Manasseh down on the day the idol was carried in. He did not split the temple in two. He did not send fire. The building stood. The priesthood continued. The sacrifices were offered. The feasts were observed. From the outside, the religion of Israel looked intact. But something had shifted in that room that no ceremony could paper over and no ritual could repair. The presence had been treated as a roommate rather than a sovereign. The holy had been asked to coexist with the profane. And it had been asked not once, not by a foreign invader, not by accident, but by the king of God's own people, deliberately for more than half a century. Before we go further, I need to ask you something. Baal promised prosperity. He promised that your crops would grow and your family would eat. Asherah promised comfort. She promised fertility, protection, and a God who was easier to live with than the one in the text. Everyone around you was doing it. Your neighbors, your children, your king. The government endorsed it. The priests tolerated it. Would you have been the one to say no? Be honest. Tell me in the comments. Because what comes next is the darkest chapter in this story, and it happened precisely because not enough people said no early enough. For 55 years, a pagan idol stood in God's room, and for 55 years, it seemed like no one cared. But there was one person who had not been born yet, and when he finally read what God had actually said, he tore his clothes and wept. He was 26 years old, and he had been king since he was 8. His name was Josiah. In 621 BC, the high priest Hilkiah was overseeing repairs to the temple, repairs to a building that had been so neglected under decades of idolatrous kings that the book of the law had been lost somewhere inside it, buried under rubble and disuse. When Hilkiah found the scroll and had it read to the young king, Josiah's response was immediate and physical. He tore his robes. He wept. He sent immediately to inquire of God because he understood, perhaps for the first time, the distance between what God had required and what Israel had become. To understand how extraordinary Josiah was, you have to understand who surrounded him. His grandfather was Manasseh, the king who placed the idol in the Holy of Holies, and who, according to 2 Kings, shed so much innocent blood that it filled Jerusalem from one end to the other. His father was Amon, a king so corrupt and so despised that his own servants assassinated him after 2 years on the throne. Josiah grew up inside a lineage of catastrophic spiritual failure, and yet when he encountered the actual words of God, something broke open in him that all of that history had not been able to suppress. What followed was the most comprehensive religious reform in Israel's recorded history. Josiah removed and burned the Asherah pole from the temple. He demolished the houses of the male cult prostitutes that stood within the temple complex itself. He defiled the Topheth, the site of child sacrifice in the valley of Hinnom, so that no one could use it again. He tore down the high places that Solomon himself had built for foreign gods centuries earlier. He destroyed altars from one end of the land to the other. 2 Kings records its verdict plainly. Before him, there was no king like him, who turned to Yahweh with all his heart, and with all his soul, and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses. Then, in 609 BC, at the age of 39, Josiah rode out to intercept Pharaoh Necho at the valley of Megiddo. He was killed by an archer. His body was brought back to Jerusalem in a chariot. The nation mourned. His son Jehoahaz lasted 3 months before being deposed by Egypt. The next king reversed everything. Within 23 years of Josiah's death, every altar had been rebuilt. Every high place had been restored. The Topheth, which Josiah had defiled, was operational again. The greatest revival in Israel's history lasted less than a single generation, and now, with every restraint removed, the third god claimed his payment. His name was Molech, and his currency was not grain, not oil, not song. It was flesh. His name is derived from the same Semitic root as the Hebrew word for king. Molech, Malcolm, was the deity of Ammon, the nation east of the Jordan, but his worship had spread west, into Phoenicia and deep into Canaan. And unlike Baal, who wanted rain rituals, and unlike Asherah, who wanted cakes and wooden poles, Molech had a different currency entirely. Not grain, not oil, not song, flesh. The most innocent flesh available. Leviticus 18:21 states the prohibition directly. You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, and so profane the name of your God. The prohibition exists because the practice existed. God does not prohibit what no one is doing. The first Israelite king documented performing child sacrifice to Molech was not a pagan king, not a foreign ruler. It was Ahaz, a descendant of David, a man sitting on the throne of God's covenant line. 2 Chronicles 28:3 records that he burned his sons in the valley of the son of Hinnom. A king on God's throne, from God's chosen dynasty, sacrificed his own children to a foreign god of fire. The site where this occurred lay just outside the southern wall of Jerusalem. The valley was called Ge-Hinnom, the Valley of Hinnom, and within it was a specific installation called the Topheth. The word Toph means drum. The Topheth was the place of the drums. Those drums you heard at the beginning of this video, now you know what they were for. They were not ceremonial, they were not musical, they were built to drown out the sounds that would come from the fire, not the crackling of wood, not the roar of the flames. The sounds the parents could not bear to hear and could not be allowed to hear, because if they heard them, they might stop. The drums were mercy, a terrible, devastating mercy. Imagine a father who has walked this road. He carried his son on his shoulders when the boy was small. He heard that boy laugh. He watched him sleep. And now he walks into the valley because the priest has told him that this is the price. This is the cost of protection. This is the insurance policy that Baal could not guarantee and that Asherah could not secure. The ultimate transaction, the ultimate premium, and the drums begin. The silence that follows that moment is the only honest response to it. This was not insanity. That is the most disturbing truth of all. It was investment. It was the terrible logic of a people who had been trained across generations to think of religion as transaction, who had been told that the gods demanded payment, and who had followed that logic to its most grotesque conclusion without ever stopping to ask whether the logic itself was wrong. The prophet Jeremiah records God's response to the Topheth in terms that are unlike almost anything else in the prophetic literature. In chapter 32, verse 35, God says of the child sacrifices in the valley of Hinnom, I did not command them, nor did it enter into my mind that they should do this abomination. Not anger in the first instance, grief, incomprehension. The God of Israel framing the practice as something so alien to his nature that he cannot find within himself the origin of the idea. It did not enter his mind. He did not conceive of it. He did not ask for it. And he had watched it happen in the valley just outside the city he had chosen as his own. No nation arrives at Molech without first passing through Baal. That line is worth sitting with. The transaction that began with a hilltop altar and a rain ritual had, over centuries and generations, followed its own logic to a valley of burning children. The economic theology of Canaan had compounded its interest until it claimed the one thing no investment should ever touch. After the Babylonian exile, the Valley of Hinnom was never restored. It was not rebuilt, not reclaimed, not repurposed for agriculture or habitation. It became instead what its history had made it, a place of perpetual waste and fire. Jerusalem's refuse was dumped there. The fires never fully went out. Worms and decay fed on what the flames did not consume. Smoke rose from it constantly. It became the city's wound that would not close. Jeremiah had already declared its new name. Chapter 19, verse 6. God says it will no longer be called Topheth or the Valley of the Son of Hinnom, but the Valley of Slaughter. In Greek, the name Gehinnom became one word, Gehenna. In the New Testament, the word Gehenna appears 12 times. 11 of those 12 appearances come from the lips of Jesus of Nazareth. In Mark chapter 9, verse 48, he describes it as the place where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. He used it as his primary term for the place of final judgment. He used a word that every person in his audience could identify. They had grown up in Jerusalem. They knew the valley to the south. Some of them had smelled the smoke. Jesus was not speaking abstractly. He was pointing at a real geography his listeners could see and smell and had walked past their entire lives. And he was saying, that place, that valley, that wound in the earth, that your ancestors filled with the worst thing they ever did. That is the image I want you to hold when you think about what it means to be finally, permanently separated from God. The valley where Israel committed its worst sin became the word the Son of God chose for eternal judgment. That is not coincidence. Baal corrupted the economics of a nation. He replaced the covenant relationship with a commercial transaction and convinced an entire people that God was a vendor, not a father. Asherah corrupted the identity of God, introduced quietly, domestically, generationally, until he had been reshaped into something more manageable, more willing to share his throne. Molech corrupted humanity itself. He took the transaction Baal had normalized and followed it to its end. And once a nation has burned its own children, there is nothing it will not do. There is no line remaining. There is no bottom left to reach. The prophet Ezekiel, writing from Babylon after the fall of Jerusalem, watches the glory of Yahweh, the visible, luminous presence that had inhabited the temple since the days of Solomon, begin to move. It rises from the cherubim above the ark. It moves to the threshold and pauses there, the way a presence lingers at the edge of a place it loves before it leaves. Then it moves east, slowly. It rests above the Mount of Olives, looking back at Jerusalem one final time. And then it is gone. No thunder, no earthquake, no declaration, just absence. The most devastating judgment God ever rendered on Israel was not a plague or an army. It was his departure. The temple stood for another few years. Then Nebuchadnezzar's army came, and when they burned the building to the ground, they were burning a structure that had already been vacated. These three entities did not retire when Babylon fell. They adapted. They shed the names and kept the architecture. Baal lives wherever faith is reduced to transaction, wherever prosperity is treated as evidence of divine favor and the relationship is replaced by ritual. Asherah lives wherever God is quietly reshaped to fit human comfort, wherever the parts of Scripture that demand holiness are set aside in favor of a God who affirms everything and requires nothing. Molech lives wherever innocence is sacrificed for security, for convenience, for the logic of necessity, not always in fire, not always in a valley. But the structure is the same, something precious offered up on the altar of what we tell ourselves we cannot live without. The names changed, The altars did not. 570 years after the glory departed, a man stood on that same mountain. He came from Galilee. He rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, while crowds spread cloaks on the road. And when he reached the place where the Mount of Olives looked out over the city, the same eastern vantage point where the glory had rested one final time, he stopped and he wept. Luke records it plainly in chapter 19, not a diplomatic expression of concern. The Greek word is specific. He wailed. The glory that had departed came back with a human face, human hands, human tears. It came back to the same mountain, looked at the same city, and instead of leaving in silence, it wept. The God who walked away, walked back. The drums have stopped. The valley is silent now. Which of these three gods, Baal, Asherah, or Molech, do you believe is the greatest threat to this generation? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. If this video opened something in you, subscribe to the channel. There is more coming that you will not want to miss.